I'm Cliff Ribner, and I'm going to talk to you today about teachers' unions. Teachers' unions are the most parasitical and one of the most destructive presences in the country. They're not there to help the students, and that's proven by the numbers. I'm going to tell you some of the numbers. And the teachers' unions were basically illegal until 1965, when suddenly they become virtually mandatory in public schools. In 1962, JFK issued an executive order permitting public employee unions for federal employees. But the states began to they were getting pushed by unions to permit unions, because what unions are, they're unelected by the rest of us, but they get to participate in everything that has to do with schools. They get to define the curriculum. They negotiate directly with the legislature and the governor. And in many cases, the legislature and the governor got elected by the union, because what the unions do is they force their members, whether they want to or not, to pay dues. And a big chunk of those dues goes to the politicians that the unions pick. So they literally handpick the people they're going to negotiate with. In 1965, Congress passed a law. It only affected public schools, but it practically mandated that schools get involved in collective bargaining with the teachers. And we know that that legislation had a significant impact on getting teachers into the union, because private schools where that legislation doesn't apply have never had more than 7 to 10% of the members in unions. But in public schools, today it's about 75%, and it reached a high watermark in 1975 of 80%. But that's most of the teachers. It also tells you that there's a not insignificant minority, like today it's 25%, who don't want to be in the union. They don't like what the union does. And the union has a major political presence. The teachers' union in particular has always been run by communists. The whole FDR was completely opposed to any public employee unions, because the whole logic behind unions, it's a Marxist logic. What it assumes that businesses are getting illegal profits, and it's essentially like a criminal enterprise. And the union is there to force the business owner to disgorge profits to his employees who would otherwise be functionally slaves. That's really the logic. During the early 20th century, when there was a shortage of jobs, in fact, during the Depression, the shortage of jobs was created by the federal government with the New Deal legislation. It basically made it impossible for employers to operate without enormous difficulty, compliance obligations. So it was a huge discouragement to employers to hire people. That's why there was a shortage of jobs, why there was super high unemployment throughout the Great Depression. In 1939, Henry Morgenthau, who was the Secretary of Treasury under FDR, told Congress the whole New Deal was a complete waste, a total waste. It didn't do anything of value, and all it did was increase the debt. And it didn't do anything about ending the Great Depression. In fact, the whole theory behind the Great Depression that they were promoting, this is why the SEC was created, was that the Great Depression started in 1929 as a result of stock manipulation. Well, Milton Friedman proved that's wrong. It was started by the Fed, which is an agency created in 1913 to monopolize our currency. And Milton Friedman proved this. It's beyond doubt that it was not stock manipulation. It was a federal agency that started the Great Depression, and it was federal activities, creating all those agencies that businesses had to report to, taking all the operational ownership away from the owners of the business as a practical matter, because they had to get permission from the government for all sorts of things. That's why unemployment was so high during the Great Depression. It didn't end until World War II, when millions of people were in the army. That was the only thing that ended the Great Depression, World War II. It's the only good thing that came from World War II. Teachers' unions were basically illegal until 1965. And then they became practically mandatory, at least in public schools. Again, private school teachers had never had them. They weren't covered by that legislation in 1965, part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. They weren't covered by it, and there's never been more than 10% of the private school teachers who've been in a union. But union membership has been very high for public school teachers. And what it's done is it's radicalized the teachers. as a group. It's transformed who teaches in schools and what they teach. And in fact, the teachers union practically dictates what they teach. The entire primary and secondary education function in this country has been taken over by the teachers union and their educational schools. They require that everybody gets certified in education programs in order to teach in the schools. You can have a PhD from Harvard in history. They won't let you teach history in the public schools unless you get an education degree. And what they teach in the education schools literally is Marxist indoctrination. That's literally what they teach. What happened was Bill Ayers, who was one of the Weather Underground leaders, and a lot of other ones too. He just happened to be very prolific in his writing of books. He identified the teaching profession as the way to spread the revolution, the Marxist revolution in America. And I'm not exaggerating. But he really did that. You can look it up if you don't believe me. This is a guy who was involved with what they call themselves the Weather Underground. This was the most wild. These people were bombing. They were doing things like bombing. In fact, there was a townhouse in Greenwich Village that blew up because they mishandled their bombs. It literally blew up the whole house. And Bill Ayers and other revolutionaries got involved in teaching teachers and in writing books that the teachers in schools where he didn't actually teach himself would use. And every teacher who gets in an education program in America has been getting these Bill Ayers books, just like to the extent they teach history. The history they teach is things like Howard Zinn's. It's called The People of History of the United States. It's not history. Howard Zinn was a communist. The whole book is a completely fraudulent presentation of some of American history, making us look like we're the worst place on the planet, instead of the only country on the planet that since its inception has been dedicated to individual liberty. You'd never know that from reading Howard Zinn's book, but it's the most commonly used history book throughout the country in high school American history classes. And that's because the teachers union practically dictates everywhere. They get control of school boards all over the country, and they completely control what goes on in the schools. And the teachers union is not interested in teaching students anything other than Marxism. It's always been run by the woman Randy Weingarten, people like her, who's in charge. She is a communist. She was instrumental in keeping the schools closed for 2 years when the panic about COVID was being spread, just totally irresponsibly. It was never that dangerous. The real statistic, we know the real statistics now. In fact, we knew the real statistics in 2020 when that cruise ship, the Diamond Princess, was finally allowed to dock in Japan. And the Japanese health bureaucrats examined it. What happened was that cruise ship had a representative sample for statistical purposes in terms of its population between the passengers and the crew. It was 4,700 people. And of those 4,700, everyone on that ship, but because of the nature of the close quarters of the ship, was exposed to COVID, which is a highly infectious disease. 80% of them had no symptoms at any time. Of that entire 4,700 people, 10 people died, every one of whom had 2 comorbidities. That was the actual statistic. You can do the math yourself to figure it out. Based on that, it's about 10 times less deadly than the seasonal flu that happens every year. So the panic was nonsense. We knew about it in March of 2021 when they did that examination of that analysis of the Diamond Princess. Randy Weingarten and the teachers union kept the schools closed for as long as they could. They wanted teachers doing nothing. They wanted those students to get nothing. They didn't, and there was never any excuse for that. The actual death rate for children from COVID, it was about a 1 in a million chance of a child dying from COVID. 1 in 2 million who didn't have multiple comorbidities. No, not a single child on the planet under 18 died from COVID who didn't have multiple comorbidities. More of them died from the shot than from COVID, and that is the truth. Anyway, that's the kind of thing the teachers union do. They're absolutely contemptuous of the students and of the parents, and they basically have their own power within the whole thing. The only one who should have any power over what goes on in the schools is the parents. And the teachers should not be obligated to any third party, like a union, which is what they are. And the union has its own interests. The percentage of teachers that belonged to the union reached its max in about 1975. At that point, 80% of the teachers, public schools, were members of the union. And now it's about 75%. During that time, the performance of students, and this is how you measure whether the teachers are teaching kids more or less, the performance of students on the SAT test, which of course are the only people who take it are college-bound students. So these are the best students in the school. It reached its high watermark in 1972, and then it was downhill. So just as the teachers union was getting established, that's when we reached the high watermark, and it went downhill with the teachers union. During that time, spending per student on how much we spent per student went from, in constant dollars, it went from $4,000 to different amounts. It's an average of $23,000. So you can do the math. It's spending about 4 times per student now. Oh, I'm sorry, it went to 15,000 as an average. So it was more than 3 times the amount per student. And in some states, it's much more than that. In New York, they spend $30,000 a student. And by the way, in New York, where they spend $30,000 per student, Mississippi, they spend the least amount per student. Less than half of what they spend in New York. I think it's $12,000 per year in Mississippi. The difference in the SAT test scores between New York and Mississippi is 20 points. It's 1043 versus 1023. So that's what they get for spending more than double in New York than is spent per student in Mississippi. And where is all the money going? It's going, first of all, teacher salaries are 60% higher. In 1969, teacher salaries were around $51,000 on an average. Now they're about $80,000 on average. Some places they're more. But what's also happened is there's been a huge increase in the number of administrators. There are twice as many administrators now overall. In some school districts, it's even more than that. But overall, there's double. For example, in 1969, the number of students per administrator was 24. So it was a 24-to-1 ratio. 1 administrator for 24 students. Today, it's 1 per 12. And so they doubled. And these administrators aren't teaching students anything. And so the substance of what is taught in school is junk. When they go to college, they need remedial courses. And they've been already inculcated, have Marxism inculcated in them. Hatred of America. That's what they're taught from kindergarten on. Some teachers are more blatant about it than others, but that's the substance of what they learn to teach in education programs. Of course, individual teachers may resist it. 25% of them don't want to be in the union. So that tells you their attitude. They don't want to be participating in that. Union gives all its money to the Democrat Party. In fact, it's one of the most powerful forces in the Democrat Party. And so you've got basically this money circle where the money comes from the citizens in the form of taxes. It goes to the teachers who are in the union. The union gets a big chunk of that, and it pays it to the Democrat Party. And then they negotiate, in many cases, with Democrat politicians who they put in office. What kind of a deal you think they get there? And in all the states, they've been given things like defined benefit plans in addition to their salaries. They're not the salaries, and by the way, they only work 9 months a year. So the administrators have gone from making about $80,000 or I think it was $80,000 in 1969. Today, or 65,000, that's what it was. 65,000 in 1969 for administrators. Today, it's almost double that. It's around 110,000 per administrator. And that's an average, by the way. There are some places where it's much more than that, and some places where it's much less. But so the spending per student has exploded. The performance has gone downhill. The substance of what they're taught is junk. And the teachers' unions they're just a parasite in the country. They do nothing of value. The only people they help are people who hate the country. It's literally the case. And it was that 1965 legislation, if that wasn't there, a huge percentage, they were given all sorts of incentives in the public school to participate in the union. The union is who represents them in all negotiations. But there's a reason why, even though private school teachers are allowed to form unions, only 7 to 10% of them have ever been in a union, because they're not covered by that legislation. So repealing that 1965 legislation would have a massive effect. And then the teachers' unions also do things like they resist alternative uses of the students' money, things like vouchers to be spent at private schools. What they've done is they have a monopoly. They've turned the public schools into a monopoly. And monopolies always produce lousy products. And they want to keep it a monopoly. They don't want students going to private school. They don't want them to be able to take the money that's allocated per student and spend it wherever they want. They want them in this particular school that they're assigned by the state. And they don't want them moving around either. Things like charter schools. They oppose those so much anytime they have the opportunity to oppose it. So what it is, they want to keep a monopoly in the schools where they've got complete control over the curriculum and over everything else, so that no one else has any opportunity to compete with them. If the public schools had a competitor, if students were allowed to take the money that's being spent on them and spend it at any school, the whole education system would be transformed. But the first thing that has to happen is that 1965 legislation has to be repealed. Teachers' unions have to be abolished. They should be considered illegal. They interfere with the Republican form of government because they participate in the legislative process. And they negotiate these contracts where they have, anytime there's a defined benefit pension plan, what that is, it's a plan where when they retire, they get a big chunk, possibly the whole amount of their salary forever. And it's just whatever it is. That is a lien on the future taxes of that state that the people who were going to be paying it in the future didn't vote for. And that's totally illegal, unconstitutional. It's called a dead hand rule. Past legislatures are not allowed to affect the spending of future legislatures. So any defined benefit plan like that, where there's money that's promised in the future that isn't part of the taxes today, that's totally unconstitutional. And that's one of the big things that they've negotiated for those teachers. They get huge pensions, so they can retire on a salary and they get another job. I'm Cliff Ribner, and if you like what I have to say, like this video, let other people know about it, let other people know about my website, cliffordribner.com, and read my book, Freedom's Last Stand. Thank you.